All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through and try and understand how Congress uses fiscal policy to close output gaps. What can Congress do through fiscal policy when the economy is in a recessionary gap and when the economy is in an inflationary gap? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw an aggregate market graph for a recessionary gap. Okay, so we'll have price level and real GDP. I'm going to throw in a long-run aggregate supply curve here. There we go, LRAS. And it's a recessionary gap, so we'll put a short-run aggregate supply curve in there and an aggregate demand curve in there. And as you can see here, short-run equilibrium is over here to the left of short-run aggregate supply. So we'll come down here, and that's real GDP, which is smaller than, it's to the left of natural real GDP, right? And so we are in a recessionary gap, okay? All right, and here's our situation. When we're in a recessionary gap, Congress does not like this because people are usually more unhappy over here than they are, actually generally people aren't very unhappy over there, but they're really unhappy over here in a recessionary gap. And here's the situation, is that output is low. Real GDP is less than what we could be getting as output, natural real GDP. Now, I want to remind you that this is, well, let me tell you what else is going on. Because real GDP is low, by Okun's law, that means unemployment is high. So we're going to say unemployment is high. All right, and we're going to say inflation is too low. Okay, now you would think, and you'd probably be right, that unemployment is the most annoying thing, that people are going to complain mostly because of unemployment, and that is probably true. I don't know the research on it, but here's the thing: people are unhappy that output is low. Remember that output is associated with utility. When output is low, utility is, well, I say low, utility is lower. When output is lower, utility is lower. And so the people in the country are not getting as much satisfaction as they could be getting. And it's getting to the point where they're noticing that they're not getting as much satisfaction as they could be getting from the economy. And so Congress is a little freaked out. They really do not like this. They want to take action. They just can't sit there and do nothing, or at least from their point of view, they just can't sit there and do nothing. Okay? All right, let's come over here to the inflationary gap and look at that situation. So we got real GDP on the horizontal, price level on the vertical. Put in a long-run aggregate supply curve in here. Long-run aggregate supply curve, okay? And then we'll put in a short-run aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve. And here's our intersection, short-run equilibrium. Come down here, you can see that real GDP is larger than natural real GDP. And so we are in an inflationary gap. I'll call it an I gap, inflationary gap, okay? So over here, we have the opposite situation. All right, let's check out our situation over here, where real GDP is greater than natural real GDP. I know what you're thinking. What's wrong with that? Well, by now, you should already know what's wrong with that. If you don't know what's wrong with that, you need to go back to the lessons where we talked about the dangers of an inflationary gap and on productive capacity and long-run aggregate supply. Remember that when we overproduce, that's like running an engine into the red zone on the tachometer. You're overusing resources. Those resources can become burned out and broken or permanently destroyed. And if we permanently destroy resources, now our long-run aggregate supply curve moves backwards, and that's not okay. So we need to be careful with our resources. We can overuse them temporarily, but that is not a sustainable circumstance. Okay, real GDP is greater than natural real GDP. Unemployment is too low. Too low. Again, what do you mean unemployment is too low? How is that even possible? Okay, you need to go back to some of the lessons where we talked about the dangers of employing people who shouldn't be employed in those jobs. This is going to lead to wage inflation and overall inflation in the economy. Unemployment, we got to be careful about employing all of our labor resources. We need flexibility in the economy for people to move from one job to another, and for people who don't have the right skills to gain those skills so that they are then ready to go into a job. Okay? In this circumstance, we are bringing people into jobs and letting them do things that they are not yet qualified to do, and we're stopping people from moving from one job to another when they should be, when they would do better for the economy over in that job than they would do in this job. Okay? So unemployment is too low, and now here's the real problem that is obvious, and that is inflation is high. Inflation is high. That's the only problem here. People are going to say, oh, well, that's really the only problem. Everything else is just fine. No, this is a problem. We need to close this inflationary gap. But Congress is less motivated to do this because this is like the party. Everybody's partying, right? It's a house party, and everybody's like, yeah, turn up the music. We're having fun. This is great. The only way you can stop a house party is if one of the neighbors calls the cops because everybody's being too loud. Well, nobody likes the person who calls the cops, and so Congress does not want to be the ones who call the cops on this party to turn the music down and bring output down to where it should be. And therefore, Congress is less likely to take the action it's supposed to take in an inflationary gap. And they're much more likely to take the action here, okay? Now, because people are really unhappy and they want to make them happy. All right, so let's look at, we got the situation. Now, here's what we need here. Over here, we either need an increase in short-run aggregate supply or an increase in aggregate demand, because either one of those will increase real GDP and bring us back into long-run equilibrium. So either an increase in short-run aggregate supply or an increase in aggregate demand. Well, fiscal policy primarily works through total expenditure, which affects aggregate demand, not short-run aggregate supply. So here's what we need. We need an increase in aggregate demand. We need an increase in aggregate demand. And so, an increase in aggregate demand, that happens when there's an increase in total expenditure, right? And which kind of fiscal policy results in an increase in total expenditure, right? That's expansionary fiscal policy. So we need expansionary fiscal policy, because we need to expand output to bring it up in line with long-run equilibrium, okay? And so, under expansionary fiscal policy, what kind of budget should we have? What should be the situation of the budget in expansionary fiscal policy? We need to run a budget deficit. We need to run a budget deficit. Whoops. And there are two ways to get a budget deficit. One way is to either increase government spending. The other way is to decrease taxes. Okay? So, when we're in a recessionary gap, the government wants to get involved. They want to close the recessionary gap, increase output, decrease unemployment, maybe bring inflation up just a little bit. Okay? They can do that by either spending more money or by decreasing taxes. When they spend more money, that's going to have a direct effect on total expenditure. There will be an increase in total expenditure if the government increases spending. Or if they decrease taxes, that's going to have an effect to increase consumption, right? Because people now have more money in their pockets, so they can spend more money, and an increase in consumption will also result in an increase in total expenditure. When total expenditure increases, total expenditure affects aggregate demand. That's an increase in aggregate demand. And an increase in aggregate demand means a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So I'm going to grab a marker here. I'm going to put a right arrow at the aggregate demand curve, a couple right arrows indicating a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve is going to move over to the right. So we're going to call this AD prime, the new aggregate demand curve, which intersects short-run aggregate supply at the long-run aggregate supply curve. So short-run equilibrium is now equal to long-run aggregate supply. So we are now back in long-run equilibrium. When in the process of that happening, this intersection for real GDP is going to move to the right, so real GDP is going to increase. So this is going to cause an increase in real GDP, okay? Closing the recessionary gap and simultaneously decreasing unemployment. So now people have more stuff, they have more utility, and more people have jobs. And so as Congress comes to the rescue with expansionary fiscal policy by running a budget deficit, now everybody in the economy is a little bit happier. Okay? All right. Now let's look at how they close an inflationary gap. Okay? So here in an inflationary gap, we need to decrease real GDP so that it's equal to natural real GDP. We can only do that in one of two ways. Either we move the aggregate demand curve to the left, or we move the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Well, this is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy works through total expenditure, which is related to aggregate demand. So what we really need here is a decrease in aggregate demand, a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So we need a decrease in aggregate demand. Now, to decrease aggregate demand, we need to decrease total expenditure. And which kind of fiscal policy results in a decrease in total expenditure? That's contractionary fiscal policy. And so we need contractionary fiscal policy. How does Congress achieve contractionary fiscal policy? What is going to be the budget position? Well, they're going to run a budget surplus. Okay, so we're going to run a budget surplus. How do they achieve a budget surplus? Well, they can control two things, government spending and taxes. And so through either both of them or each one of them individually, they can get a budget surplus by either decreasing government spending or by increasing taxes. Now remember an increase in taxes means that people will have less money in their bank account. That means households can't spend as much money. That's going to result in a decrease in consumption. And a decrease in government spending along with a decrease in consumption, well, that's ultimately going to result in a decrease in total expenditure in the economy. So decrease in government spending leads to a decrease in total expenditure. Decrease in consumption leads to a decrease in total expenditure. A decrease in total expenditure will result in a decrease in aggregate demand. And a decrease in aggregate demand is indicated by a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So I'm going to put a left arrow here and a left arrow here. And our aggregate demand curve is going to move to the left. Oops. And we'll call that AD prime. And the new short-run equilibrium will go leftward and downward, but mainly we care about leftward, so that short-run aggregate supply meets up with the long-run aggregate supply curve, and we are now in long-run equilibrium. In the meantime, while this short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, that's going to result in a decrease in real GDP so that it is equal to natural real GDP. And so this decrease in aggregate demand is also going to result in a decrease in real GDP, and a decrease in real GDP will result in an increase in unemployment. Uh-oh. I thought you said we were solving problems here, Mr. Ryan. That's not a B, that's an L and an O. Sorry about that. Unemployment. There we go. I thought we were solving problems here, Mr. Ryan. Are you telling me that contractionary fiscal policy is going to cause unemployment? Well, I guess that's one way to look at it. It does cause unemployment. But remember that unemployment was already too low. The unemployment that it's causing is it's taking away those job opportunities for the fake people that aren't ready for those job opportunities, and it's allowing a flexibility of unemployment so that people can leave the jobs where they're not very effective and move over to the jobs where they are more effective. That's what I mean by an increase in unemployment. This is not cyclical unemployment. Over here, the decrease in unemployment, this unemployment is high, that's because we had cyclical unemployment. There was cyclical unemployment here, okay? And so we need to get rid of the cyclical unemployment. So when unemployment decreases here after expansionary fiscal policy, the decrease in unemployment effectively is eliminating cyclical unemployment, where over here, this unemployment is too low. We have eaten away at structural and frictional unemployment. Structural and frictional unemployment are too low, and over here, when unemployment goes up, it's not adding cyclical unemployment, it's adding frictional and structural unemployment, bringing us back to full employment, the natural rate of unemployment, long-run equilibrium, okay? And that is contractionary fiscal policy. Now, last thing I want to say is this is just sort of my own personal opinion, I guess you could say. It's technically not opinion, but I mean, it is opinion, I guess. There's something very curious about what we're looking at here. If you know anything about the U.S. economy and the United States budget, I'm going to tell you a couple things. First of all, in our economy, one way, and this is sort of, again, this is where my opinion comes in, but based on what I have seen in terms of numbers from GDP, we have spent more time in the U.S. economy in an inflationary gap than we have in a recessionary gap, maybe, let's say, over the past 70 years, okay? We haven't had as many recessions as we have had boom periods, or let me say it this way. Our boom periods tend to last longer than our recession periods, okay? But in the last 70 years, we've had fewer than 10 years where we have run a budget surplus in our economy. And we have had many, many years where we have been running a budget deficit. So if we haven't spent as much time in a recessionary gap, then you would think that we wouldn't spend very much time running a budget deficit. And if we have spent a little more time in an inflationary gap, even if it's just a very small one, we should have been running more of a budget surplus. Now, there's a couple explanations for this. The first one is that we never, ever really know when we're in a recessionary gap, and we never, ever really know when we're in an inflationary gap. I mean, unless it's extreme, we don't really know. And so the government, if they're unsure, they might run on a budget deficit just in case we're in a recessionary gap instead of a budget surplus, okay? The other thing is this. The second reason we've probably run a budget deficit a lot more is that a budget deficit is much more popular with voters. So if you're a voter, if all the people in America who are voting these Congress people into their jobs in Washington, let's say that one guy stands up, or woman stands up and says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We are going to spend more money on all the programs that help you, and we're going to lower taxes. You may think about whether you want to vote for that person. Let's say that the person running against that candidate stands up and says, vote for me. I'm going to spend less money on all the programs that you like, and I'm going to raise taxes. So chances are you're going to vote for the other person. So the person who's more likely to run the budget surplus is just less likely to get voted into office. And once they're in office, they're more likely to run a budget deficit because that's what's going to keep them in office if they're spending money on the things you like and lowering taxes. And therefore, what we have found is that deficit spending is a lot more popular among voters than running a budget surplus. And the result of that is that we have a very large national debt in this country. And the national debt is something we're going to talk about in the next set of lessons, okay? But this is fiscal policy, how Congress uses fiscal policy to close a recessionary gap or to close an inflationary gap.